on Sunday, the kids are running around. Good morning. Let me invite, if there are any friends in Keller Hall, let me invite you in to the sanctuary so that we can get started. It's a beautiful Saturday morning. It's good to be here together on site, and it's good. I know we have many registrations online, so welcome to the Pajama Club at home, people who are tuned in. And for those who are in the sanctuary, we do want you to know we have assisted listening devices out in Keller Hall. There are restrooms, water, and friends there to help with anything you might need. So we're glad to be together. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm the senior pastor here at Circular Congregational Church, and it's just a delight to welcome you back to our second spring lecture with Professor Tiya Miles. I have a brief introduction, but first, a repeated note of thanks. Thanks to the church staff and volunteers for making all of this possible. Thanks to Buxton Books, our community partners, for bringing the book table. Thanks to the Circular Church Endowment for underwriting all of this so that it could be free and we could all enjoy it. Thanks to you for coming. And thanks again to Tiya Miles for traveling here to be with us. I gave a longer introduction last night, and so I'd invite you to view that on YouTube if you'd like to hear the longer version. But let me just tell you that Tiya Miles is the Michael Garvey Professor of History and Radcliffe Alumna Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. And I think what I'd like to do in celebration of this time is just begin with a kind of blessing for what we're doing this morning, and then invite Tiya to present to us. Friends, in a time when higher education is under threat, we gather to learn from an esteemed professor's research. In a time when Black history would be erased or censored by some, we gather to celebrate the power of Black history and storytelling. In a time when women's rights are being taken away, we gather to be guided by the wisdom of women's lived experience. In a time when some would forget our past, whitewash it, or smooth it over, we gather to remember and tell the whole truth of it, as much as we can stand, as James Baldwin said, and then a little more. In a time when some would seek to divide us and take our power away, we gather to celebrate our common humanity and find in it the shared strength to work for a fairer, more just world for us and all our living kin. And may that be a blessing for our time together. And will you join me in welcoming back our friend and teacher, Professor Tiya Miles.
Thank you very much for those words, Pastor. Good morning, everyone. You're in the sanctuary. Thank you. I love hearing those voices. Hi, everybody who's online. I love that notion of the pajama club. I think I want to be in the pajama club. You know, I wasn't going to say this, but I think I will, given Reverend Jeremy's opening remarks. It is a really difficult time in academia, as well as in many sectors across the country. And I was recently in a meeting with some faculty colleagues and a graduate student, and the graduate student was concerned about her dissertation topic because its focus was on Indigenous, African, and European women and their medicinal midwifery practices. And she was worried that this is the kind of topic that would be kind of disallowed or that wouldn't be able to get funding in our contemporary moment or even into the future. And I looked around the table and I realized, and I said this out loud, that every single one of us work on topics that include words that have been flagged. So my research focuses on Black history, Indigenous history, and women's history. Every single one of those topics has been flagged as potentially problematic. I was sitting around the table with scholars who are Black, white, Native American, male and female, and different combinations of those. And every single one of us, because of our combination of characteristics, could have been labeled a so-called, quote, DEI hire, because now that term seems to suggest that if you are anyone who does not come in a certain kind of normative phenotypical package, that you only got your job because somebody was looking to fill a slot or to check a box. With all this in mind, as I worked on sending my titles over to Catherine, who's been so wonderful in helping me to make arrangements and to host me, I was actually worried about this one, and I gave it some thought. I wondered, is it okay to have words like enslaved or Black or women? Is it okay to have a topic that's on the environment and on the climate when I'm about to come to Charleston and share some thoughts? And so I wrote a little question to my message to Catherine, which was actually coded. I don't know if you picked up on the fact that it was around this worry, but I asked her, do you think these would be topics that would be of interest to your community? That was code. And she came back with a yes, our community would love to hear about these topics. So it's reassuring, it's affirming to know that there are communities like this one, congregations like this one, here and all around the country, even in places that are categorized as red or conservative politically, that are interested and committed in this domain. So I thank you very much for being here. Some of you are familiar faces, and I'm glad you came back. I'm impressed that you were willing to come back this morning, and you'll hear me building on some of the things that I shared last night about Harriet Tubman. And for those of you who are here for the first time this morning, welcome. I'm very glad to see you and looking forward to talking with you. I do need to let you know that I'm going to be kind of hustling out of here a little bit quicker today because, once again, Catherine very kindly made an appointment for me to go to the fairly new African American Museum here in town. I haven't had a chance to visit it yet, and as many of you know, it now has on display an artifact which is called Ashley Sack, which I wrote a whole book about. So I'm thrilled to be here with you, and also eager to go and see the sack again right after our time today. All right, so what I wanted to share this morning is a set of stories and insights, observations that I've made about enslaved Black women and their experiences in the natural world. I mentioned last night that because of the comment of a colleague many years ago, I started to see Harriet Tubman in a different way, kind of through a different lens, as somebody who was intimately connected with her environment. And at that time, I started collecting material about Harriet Tubman and other enslaved women and men in relation to how they saw nature and how they moved through the natural world. And I ended up having folders and files and notes on this material, which I have been able to channel into the book Night Flyer that I focused on last night, and also into the book Wild Girls, which some of you have seen, which is a short book talking about the ways in which girls in the 1800s were able to shape their characters and hone their perspectives by being outside. And I've also channeled some of that material into my presentation for you here this morning. The main idea here is that enslaved Black women developed relationships with features of the natural world, that they saw beauty and possibility in nature, and that they acted through or with an environmental consciousness, enlisting nature in their efforts to defend against an authoritarian system of slavery. In Night Flyer, I develop a phrase drawn from the work of other scholars as well to try to capture what I think is going on in Harriet Tubman's relationship with nature. And that phrase is luminous pragmatism, that Harriet Tubman seemed to have really been keyed into the light, the beauty, the sublime, the spirit, the magic of nature. And she was also very, very practical, very, very hands-on in terms of how she saw and interacted with the natural world. She was able to see nature and move through nature in both these ways simultaneously, seeing and feeling the luminous and thinking about and enacting the practical. And this is something that comes up across numerous stories that we have of enslaved Black women's lives. What I'm going to go into today are some stories that we have, some true-to-life stories that were written by enslaved women or told to other people by enslaved women that help us to see what their lives were like embedded in nature. These stories come from Kentucky, North Carolina, Maryland, and we're going to end with South Carolina. And what we see in them is that enslaved Black women look to nature for physical assistance, for physical help in living their lives, but also for an inspiring interpretive language, a way to say things about their lives, as a source of emotional affirmation, that is a way to not be alone, to sense that they were feeling with other beings as they went about their lives, and also for a kind of psychological anchoring, the ability to feel grounded in their own psyches amidst chaos and trauma. So the stories that I'm going to share with you suggest that these enslaved Black women had an acute consciousness of the natural world, and they accumulated knowledge about how to live in and with nature. This consciousness and this knowledge enabled them to fight back against physical, spiritual, and psychic threats. For the first woman and her story, I'm going to begin by reading a poem. I'd like to ask Francis if you could please advance the slide. Thank you. We're going to now talk about Margaret Garner, and I'll tell you more about her biography in just a moment. The poem that I'm going to read a snippet of was written by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a free Black woman who lived in Philadelphia, and she wrote, she gave speeches, she was an abolitionist, she was also a feminist, and she published a poem in 1857 called The Slave Mother, Tale of the Ohio. So this comes from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's poem about Margaret Garner. Harper wrote, "She fled, and with her children all, she reached the stream and crossed it o'er. Bright visions of deliverance came, like dreams of plenty to the poor." So in this poem, we have the first written account, which was also a form of commemoration of the woman Margaret Garner and of her story. Margaret Garner's story is incredibly sad, and it is now quite famous. It's well known because her story formed the basis of Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. It's also been written about in children's books, and Beloved was turned into an opera. So this story has been told in many ways across the decades. Margaret Garner was a young woman enslaved in rural Kentucky, and she was permitted by her owner to marry a man named Robert Garner, presumably a man she loved. But we need to remember that even though some enslavers did allow the people they owned to marry, those marriages were not legal. They did not have the respect of the law or the respect of the people around them. So even though Margaret Garner was married to her husband, Robert Garner, the person who owned her, Archibald Gaines, forced her into a long-term sexual relationship since the time that she was a teen. So when Margaret Garner turned 22, she was pregnant, and she already had 4 children. Some of these children were fathered by her husband, the man she had chosen, and some were fathered by the man who owned her. We can't know what was going through Margaret's mind or going through Robert's mind, but they decided that in this 5th pregnancy, they were not going to remain in this horrific situation. So in the winter of 1856, Margaret and Robert determined that they were going to free their family. And their family was all-inclusive. Their family included those babies who had been conceived through violence. And this was actually the case for many African-American families at the time, that the children were the children, no matter how or who fathered them. So Margaret and Robert determined they were going to run away, and they did so by crossing the frozen Ohio River that winter. The river had been frozen solid, and this enabled the family to cross on foot. Now, this would have been impossible for most Midwestern winters. This winter was special. It was different. That and chose to cross at that time tells us how aware of the natural world they were. So the Garners reached the home of some of Margaret's 3 relatives in Ohio, and they had plans to move along the Underground Railroad to safety, but their reprieve was brutally brief because Archibald Gaines stormed the cabin where they were hiding with officers by his side, because by this time he had the law behind him. The Fugitive Slave Act had been passed, which said that enslavers could cross into the north to recapture people who were fleeing for their lives and trying to save themselves, and that northern officers of the law were compelled to aid them. There are echoes in our political environment today. So the cabin was surrounded. Archibald Gaines was there. Margaret would have heard the voice of her former captor and her abuser, and something inside her snapped. She began to attack her children, and she was quoted as saying, "Before my children shall be taken back to slavery, I will kill every one of them." Margaret Garner did take the life of her toddler, the youngest child, who observers said looked very much like her enslaver. This youngest child was quite light-skinned and had his features. Margaret Garner also injured the other children before she was restrained by officers. A trial followed. It was sensationalized. It was covered in the papers, and especially the abolitionist papers, because there was a legal question at the center of it, which was, how should Margaret Garner be categorized legally? Was she a person, in which case she would be held liable for murder and face those legal consequences? Or was she a thing, in which case her life should be spared because her life wasn't really a human life and she should be remanded to her owner? The court determined that Margaret Garner was a thing, and so she was given back to the man who had abused her for so many years. And Archibald Gaines, as a form of punishment, promptly sold Margaret Garner and her children downriver into Deep South slavery. Something mysterious happened on the ship as the family was being sold down to Louisiana, and that is one of the children ended up going overboard and dying in the water. Sources at the time speculated that this was Margaret Garner's final effort to save her children from lifelong bondage. This is a terrible story, I know. But in Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's commemoration of Margaret Garner's experience, she keyed into the environment as a way to tell that story and as a way to present Garner as not being alone as she was attempting to flee enslavement in Kentucky. So in this poem, The Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio, Harper features an enslaved mother who's fleeing across the frozen river. And Harper writes about how this mother is trying to save her children from, quote, a darkly threatened doom. In the poem, Harper shows features of the environment, the water, the weather, the trees, and the sky, as being elements that were almost alive and there with Garner. Harper writes, winter and night were on the earth as this mother's flight begins. And she personifies these features of nature, talking about how the trees were shivering and the breeze was murmuring and the winter was sighing. Meanwhile, the northern star was shining bright overhead. We talked last night about how Polaris, the North Star, was so important to Harriet Tubman. Harper includes that here. The northern star as a light and a guide and a form of companionship. Ultimately, even though Garner does successfully escape with her family, we know that tragedy follows. But Harper does focus on this landscape that is full of animacy, this landscape that is full of vibrancy, that moves with Garner and seems to feel with Garner as she makes her escape. As you recall from the stanza of the poem that I read at the beginning of the talk, Harper talks about bright visions of deliverance that Garner would have held. And this brightness is reflected in nature, it's reflected in the star. The vision of deliverance remains, even though in this instance, the actual attempt at gaining freedom fails. One of the remarkable things about the story and about this moment is that the Garner family wasn't the only family that made this attempt. This particular winter was incredibly cold. It was one of the coldest days on record in the history of Kentucky, since we have records, when they ran away. And many other people also ran across the Ohio River during that same time period. So the Garners didn't make it, but other people did. Other people did run, and they did make it because they were able to see nature as an ally, because they were so conscious and aware of their natural world and watching for, how long we don't know, but I can only imagine that maybe some of these individuals and families were watching the weather for days, for weeks, for months, for years, looking for the opportunity to flee. And some of them were able to flee with the help of that frozen Ohio. Just as an aside and a personal note, the Ohio River does not freeze very often. But strangely enough, it froze several times in the decade after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This is one of these mysteries that I just sit and I wonder about. That's really odd. A river that hardly freezes several times right after a draconian law is passed, and many enslaved people are able to use it to cross over to the north. I don't know, I'll leave that with you. But I'll also tell you that one of the few other times that this river froze was during my childhood. And I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up on that river. And there was a winter when I was 7, it's the winter of 77, 78, when we had really freezing cold temperatures and the river froze. And my father decided he was going to take his daughters out there to walk on that frozen river. Now, I say now that I'm sure he didn't tell a single woman in our family that this was his plan, because there is no way on this earth that a mother or grandmother would have said, okay, we agree to that, great idea. But Daddy did it. He took me and my little sister out in that frozen river, and I remember what it was like. It was very scary. It was very scary because we were far out on the river. We could see Kentucky on the other side, but it was also completely exhilarating. There was a sense of magic and even empowerment in knowing that we were doing something that seemed impossible. And I could only imagine that enslaved people in the 1800s, with lives, of course, so different from ours, would have felt similarly, that it was incredible and maybe even miraculous that they could cross this ice bridge to freedom. I'm thinking back to when I was looking into this winter and doing some research on it. And when I found some accounts of this frozen winter, the reference was always to, there are old timers today who still remember when the river froze in the 70s. I was like, oh my goodness, is that me? I guess I'm an old timer. I remember when the river froze. But this was a big deal, and there was an anniversary of it recently. You can find it if you want to. You can look for it online and see old photos too of this moment. So Margaret Garner, enslaved Black women, enslaved people, looked to the environment as tools for resistance, for material resistance, for emotional sustenance, and also for a language, for a way to write about, to represent what it is they were living through. Experiences in and with nature shaped Black women's daily lives and colored their tales of captivity and their representations of attempts at gaining freedom. These stories that we have tell us that they were persistently aware of the world around them. I'm going to talk a bit about Harriet Jacobs now as well. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. And Harriet Jacobs is another person whose story you may be familiar with. She wrote a narrative that is quite well known now. It's taught at a number of levels in high schools, colleges, and graduate schools. Her narrative is titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It was published in 1861, and it is the most detailed, thoughtful account that we have that's firsthand, written by the person, of Black women's experiences in slavery. Harriet Jacobs was born in Edenton, North Carolina, and her narrative is highlighted by various aspects of nature. Terrible things happen in her narrative, as was the case in all enslaved girls and women's lives. She talks about how she learned at the age of 6 that she was a slave. She hadn't been aware of that previously, in part because her mistress, the woman who owned her, was someone who she referred to as being kind. This person actually taught her how to read. And this person also promised that she would free Jacobs' mother and free Jacobs. But this did not happen. And this mistress died when Jacobs was a child. And the man who ended up getting control of Jacobs got a hold of her, and seemed as if he was intentional in trying to do that by somehow finagling it so that the will was changed at the last minute. A codicil was written onto the will, which said that he would gain control of Harriet Jacobs. And so while she was in the household of this doctor, Dr. Norcom, Jacobs was, from her adolescence, sexually harassed. And again, we don't know everything, and she certainly was not going to write everything. In the late 1850s, when she wrote and then finally published this book in 1861, she doesn't tell us the full details, but I think that we can imagine a story somewhat aligned with Margaret Garner's story. So Jacobs experienced trauma as a teen, and she made a decision which is really difficult to imagine, but she decided that rather than become the sexual victim of her master, she was going to enter a sexual relationship with another white man who was equal in status with her master, because she felt that this other white man could give her some kind of protection or cover from a relationship that she would not choose. So she writes in her memoir, "I know what I did, and I did it deliberately." She became the mistress of a wealthy politician in the town, and she had children with him. Her owner, her master, was still intent upon trying to isolate her and to sexually abuse her, and so she had to mastermind an ingenious escape, which she did. She ran away from his son's plantation, and she hid in her grandmother's attic, the attic of her grandmother's shed, for almost 7 years, in a little tiny space that wasn't even that much larger than this pulpit area and this podium here. It was so small that Harriet Jacobs couldn't even stand inside that space. But this is what she had to do in order to trick her owner into believing that she had escaped to the north. And once he believed she had escaped, he was then willing to sell her children. Before, he was holding on to them as bargaining chips. He was willing to sell her children to their father, which initially did not secure their freedom, because the father held on to them and lent them out to his relatives. But eventually, in the end, it did secure their freedom, and Jacobs was able to escape to the north and to have her children join her there. So in this very dramatic narrative, Harriet Jacobs talks about features of the natural world over and over and over again. I actually created a set of notes where I wrote down all the different kinds of nature that she described and counted each mention. And this is the order in which she talked about different aspects of nature. Water was the first thing she talked about all the time. Wind, sunshine, starlight, woods, dirt, vines, fruit, and the atmosphere. She talked about river and swamps as providing escape routes and hiding places. She talked about woods and trees offering shade, places of rest, and spaces of sacred ritual. Really interestingly, when Jacobs decided she was going to escape that plantation, she arrived at the stop by sitting on a stump. So she was sort of with a tree as she made her plan for escape. She also writes about the ways in which enslaved people would worship in the woods to shield themselves from the scrutiny of their owners. She talks about other black women hiding in the woods and swamps, and she, in fact, hid in the swamp before her escape. Last night, we talked about how Harriet Tubman's mother, Rit Green, hid in the swamp with her son for a period of time to protect him as well. In spaces of nature, there was a different kind of law operating, Harriet Jacobs seems to suggest. There was a defiance of man-made law. There was instead the law of the natural world, which we could talk about as a law of physics. But Harriet Jacobs was a devout woman, much like Harriet Tubman, and she probably would have said that operating in the natural world was actually the law of God. So she looked to nature, a place where human beings did not have authority, they did not control everything that was happening, as her means of respite. We see this especially in the period when she was hiding out in the snaky swamp as a part of her escape plan. When Harriet Jacobs finally does escape and finally does gain her freedom in Philadelphia, she describes that experience in naturalistic language, as Harriet Tubman did, which we talked about a bit last night. She was on a boat that had been captained by a man who was friendly to the abolitionist cause, and she was there with another enslaved black woman who decided to flee with her. And this is what Jacobs said when they crossed over into freedom. Quote, "I called Fanny to see the sunrise for the first time in our lives on free soil. We watched the reddening sky and saw the great orb come up slowly out of the water, as it seemed. Soon the waves began to sparkle, and everything caught the beautiful glow. Before us lay the city of strangers. We looked at each other, and the eyes of both were moistened with tears." This is a gorgeous moment where Harriet Jacobs, in order to capture the depth of her feeling, has to turn to nature for her vocabulary. But even as nature is a place of respite, it's a place of succor, it's sort of a balm for Harriet Jacobs, it also is a place of danger and threat for Jacobs and other enslaved people. The sunlight represents freedom in her account, but of course the sun could also bear down on an enslaved person in the fields. Trees provided shade and places to think and contemplate one's situation in Jacob's account, but trees could also be turned into whipping posts. Rivers could take people to freedom in Jacob's account and also in Margaret Garner's experience, but rivers could also bear bodies down into their depths. And I say this because even while I am sharing with you ways in which enslaved black women look to nature as a partner in survival, they also recognized that nature was Janus-faced. Harriet Jacobs gives an example of the way in which the river, which carried so many people to freedom, which she talks about, could also lead people to their deaths. She witnessed a suicide that she writes about in her narrative, and here's what she says about it. I saw a woman rush wildly by, pursued by two men. She was a slave, the wet nurse of the master's children. For some trifling offense, her mistress ordered her to be stripped and whipped. To escape the degradation and the torture, she rushed to the river, jumped in, and ended her wrongs in death. One of my colleagues, the historian Walter Johnson, talks about how even though enslavers attempted to fully control the lives of the people they owned, that enslaved people always held that final card. This is one woman who decides to play that final card by jumping into the river. So last night I talked a lot about Harriet Tubman. I'm not going to go over many of those details right now, but I encourage you, if you weren't here last night or haven't watched from last night, to perhaps go check out that video or to check my book out at the library, Night Flyer. And there are also many other wonderful biographies of Harriet Tubman that you can read. There's one by Kate Larson, there's one by Catherine Clinton. There's a new book out which is focused on the Combahee River Civil War Raid by Etta Fields Black that you could also read. So there's lots of ways to get more detail filled in about Harriet Tubman's biography. What I want to tell you is that now there is a beautiful state park in Dorchester County, Maryland, which is dedicated to telling the story of Tubman's life. And this park has been interpreted through an environmental lens. It is really quite wonderful. It is built right next to the Blackwater Wildlife Refuge, and it attempts to, in some ways, preserve, or to have people consider that there's a possibility of preservation, the natural world that Harriet Tubman moved through. So if you go, you will see lots of literature and signs that are pointing out the different features of the trees today, the water today, the wildlife today, and making connections to Harriet Tubman's time. This is a really fitting commemoration of Tubman's life and her contributions, because she was a person who reveled in the outdoors. She reveled in the natural world. And this is despite the fact that she was forced to do all kinds of horrible labor outside from a very young age, from the age of 6 years old. Tubman refused indoor labor when she could, and instead chose to work outside. One of the people who knew her and interviewed her said that as a teenager, Tubman, quote, drove oxen, carted, plowed, cut wood, and hauled logs, performing Herculean tasks. That's the end of that quote. As Tubman matured into her later teens and younger 20s, she was able to lease out her own time. That is, she convinced her owner to allow her to find people who would pay for her labor, and she would get a tiny part of it, and her master would get most of it. During this time, when Tubman was working outside, she was constantly terrified, and she told someone who knew her, quote, "I was not happy or contented. Every time I saw a white man, I was afraid of being carried away. I had 2 sisters carried away in a chain gang. One of them left 2 children. We were always uneasy." So Tubman, working outside during this period of her life, was constantly terrified. She had nightmares about being taken away. She had visions during the day, which were really traumatic flashbacks to seeing her sisters taken away. And yet, she was able to find little moments of peace outside. The director of the Harriet Tubman home in New York has said about Tubman, she loved the beauty and she loved the quiet. A person who knew Tubman in her own time has said that even though Tubman endured a head injury, which was traumatic and led to what scholars today think was temporal lobe epilepsy, quote, The blow produced a disease of the brain, which was severe for a long time, and still makes her very lethargic. She cannot remain quiet 15 minutes without appearing to fall asleep. It is not refreshing slumber, but a heavy, weary condition which exhausts her. She therefore loves great physical activity and direct heat of the sun, which keeps her blood actively circulating. So here was somebody who at the time, who knew Tubman and who talked with her, who said that even though Tubman now had a disease of the brain, she was suffering from severe seizures, being outdoors helped her, and being under the light and warmth of the sun helped to soothe some of those symptoms. When Tubman was working outside, we talked about last night how she managed to get herself onto a lumberjack crew that was led by her father. And this was a time when she was working with him frequently and learning what he knew about the forest. He was a skilled timberman. She was, as I mentioned last night, quote, getting fitted for the work the Lord was getting ready for me all those years that she was out working in the woods. During her Underground Railroad activism time, Tubman would read the trees. She would forage for wild plants that could nourish her and the people who were with her. And she also imitated the barred owl's call as a sign to the people that she was with that the way was clear. What Tubman exemplified in her own life, and especially in the periods when she was helping people escape to freedom, was something that the environmental studies scholar Kimberly Ruffin has referred to as a, quote, ecological confidence. Tubman studied the woods. She learned the woods. She understood about the plants. She knew about the animals. She knew about the waterways. She was confident in her knowledge. And based on that confidence, she charged down pathways of her own making with people she was attempting to aid. Now, last night I talked all about Harriet Tubman's spiritual power and her belief in God and her faith that every step she took was led by God. This is a fundamental aspect of what made her who she was. But right now what I want to emphasize is that she also had a wealth of knowledge. She had training in the outdoors. She had ecological confidence, which enabled her to answer what she felt was the call of God. I mean, you could imagine someone who felt like they were hearing God's call to go into the woods, but thought, I'm not going in there. This was not Tubman. She was a person who could bring together, who could combine her faith in God with her knowledge of the natural world to do incredible things. Now, I want to say as well that along with this confidence, there was an aspect that the same scholar, Kimberly Ruffin, refers to as an ecological burden and beauty paradox that shaped Tubman's life and the lives of other enslaved women. There was a beauty in the natural world. There were tools for the taking in the natural world, but there was also a burden in the natural world. Nature could be dangerous, and nature could also hold traumatic memories. The same outdoors that Tubman used to free herself and other people were the very outdoors where she was forced, as a child, just 6 years old, to collect the dead bodies of muskrats that one of the men who leased her out was trading. So this small child was opening these metal traps in brackish waters, cold waters, without shoes, without proper gear. Surely this memory flashed across her mind, even as she was a young woman and an older woman who was committed to this struggle. So there is an ecological burden and beauty paradox that she carried with her and that other enslaved women carried with them. I want to talk about just one more example which gets to this notion of the beauty but also the terror and the trauma in nature. And this example comes from right here in South Carolina. It comes from Mamie Garvin Fields, who was an educator at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And she co-wrote a life story called Lemon Swamp and Other Places with two of her granddaughters, Karen and Barbara Fields. So Mamie Garvin Fields grew up in Charleston. She was a member of a middle-class black family that was engaged in education, clubs. So she had a life that was more comfortable than most black people at the time. But Mamie Garvin Fields also learned about a different kind of life that black people had lived, that her own family members, her own ancestors had lived. Because every summer, her family would go and visit Lemon Swamp. Does anybody know where Lemon Swamp is, by the way? Has anybody been there? I wonder. Yeah, maybe? They would go visit Lemon Swamp, which was out in the country. And this was a place that Mamie Garvin Fields remembered as being beautiful and magical and alive. She reminisced, quote, "All kinds of wild things grew in Lemon Swamp. Tall, sweet-smelling pine trees, huge live oaks that touch one another over the road, ferns of every shape growing close to the water, other plants growing right in the water." She watched birds there that you could never see anywhere else, she said. She observed the little animals, and she thought of this cool swamp as a room where, she said, trees and bushes threw shadows like curtains. So as a girl, she loved Lemon Swamp. It was a magical place for her to go and be in nature. But Mamie Garvin Fields also heard from her family, and she knew that Lemon Swamp was a marker. It was a symbol of terrible trauma in their family, because this was a place that separated her family. Mamie Garvin Fields said, "My grandmother was lost in Lemon Swamp and was never seen again." The way her grandmother was lost is that the owner of Mamie Garvin Fields' grandfather and grandmother and their children heard or feared that Sherman's troops were coming through, and he decided he was going to flee with his family and many of their most valuable things. She says the best furniture, the good dishes, and his silver and his gold. And to do this, he had to take enslaved people with him. He determined that he was also going to take Mamie Garvin Fields' grandmother with him to take care of his and his wife's children. So this owner of her grandparents is going to flee with his family and all of their expensive things. He needs enslaved people to ensure the safety of his children and these things. And he determined he was going to take Fields' grandmother, but leave her grandfather and leave her own children behind. Now, this grandmother had a breast child who was nursing, a lap child, a floor child, and a walker, all forced to be left behind. Her grandfather begged their owner. She says he begged the master, "Do not take my wife." But of course, that plea was not going to be honored. The master took the grandmother, took the wife, and Mamie Garvin Fields remembered not a word ever came back from the owner or his wife or from Grandma. So, Mamie Garvin Fields says about Lemon Swamp, "If it was a beautiful secret room in the daytime, it was the boogeyman's pit at night." For each of these women, nature was a source of information, inspiration, and also protection. It could feed their imaginations. It could help them to feel that they weren't alone. It became a language of representation of their experiences. But it was also a source of pain and a source of danger. The trick that these enslaved black women had to perform was understanding that complexity and negotiating it over the course of their lives. And they did this. They learned to use nature as a helper, to see nature as an ally, and also to recognize that nature could be a danger. I think that discussing these stories of slavery in the natural world may offer us lessons for our own times. It is the case that Black women were able to find in a natural world that was ravaged by slavery at least one rare earth element, which I will call hope, borrowing from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's language in that poem, where she talks about the hope of deliverance. Enslaved Black women held on to that hope despite the trauma. And I think that their stories encourage us to approach our damaged worlds and this particular difficult time with a sense of luminous pragmatism, sifting out ways that we can live together with grace on this traumatized planet. Thank you.
We're going to open up our question and response time, and those of you who were here last night, I'm not going to repeat everything that I said, but for those of you who are here for the first time, we just ask for concise, clear questions without stories or long thoughts. We often overtalk because we don't trust that we have a good question, so trust it. And Catherine will pass the microphone around.
So with regard to the climate crisis and the Black, Indigenous, and women's voices you've studied, do you have a sense of what they might say to us?
So, yes. The question was, in regard to the climate crisis and the Black and Indigenous women I've studied, do I have a sense of what they might say to us? And what I'm thinking right now is, I think that they would say, recognize the time you're in. You know, see and know what is going on. We already had a climate crisis that was accelerating. And now we're moving into an administrative environment in which efforts to prevent the worst damage are being undercut. So we have to see what's going on. I think they would also say to us that the natural world is so critical that we must do all that we can to protect it. A thought that occurred to me while doing the work on Harriet Tubman is that without the woods, we would have no Harriet Tubman. The woods shaped her. The woods enabled her freedom and the freedom of so many others. As plantation owners engaged in clear cutting, they were actually destroying the environments that allowed people to move secretly into safety. We need our natural worlds, and who knows what's going to happen in the near future or distant future, but I think we're going to need it even more in those coming months and years than we do now. So this leads me to say that these women were also caretakers of the natural world. They were caretakers, even if it was just a tiny little garden plot that they were able to get a hold of because the person who owned them permitted it, because this, of course, reduced the amount they had to pay for feeding enslaved people. They would allow enslaved families to sometimes have a garden plot. And women cared for these plots. They grew all kinds of things in these plots. They grew things in these plots in ways that were really innovative and really smart and wise. So they grew different plants together that could help each other, they could shelter each other, which is a wonderful metaphor for us today, actually. Indigenous women were also, of course, caretakers of their natural world. They knew how to care for the plants. They knew how to gather wild plants and wild foods. This is something that I think we would all probably do well to try to learn a little bit about and try to share knowledge about. I think that even if we just have a balcony, if we just have a yard, we can use these spaces to try to grow food, to try to grow beautiful flowers that we can share with others to lift their spirits. And if any of us in the sanctuary or kind of online, has the means to get a hold of an acre or 2 or 3 or 4, we can do some of that work of caring for the natural world and preserving it intact that our government is, it seems, not going to be doing as much of in the future, or at least the short-term future.
Yes, Professor Miles, thank you for 2 wonderful teachings. My question is, when your dad took you and your sister out on the ice, was he not just exposing you to extreme natural event, but was he kind of reliving a slave narrative of escape, it being the Ohio River with you, do you think?
Well, he didn't talk about anything like that, but I can't help but think that he had that on his mind as he took us out to the river, because I didn't share this, but a branch of my father's family was actually enslaved in Kentucky. They were enslaved right across that river. So we were in some ways literally looking onto the lands of our ancestors where they were held as chattel. And I will also share that due to the help of Jesse Bustos Nelson, who is a researcher based here in Charleston, I also know now that part of my father's family was enslaved in South Carolina. Our last name is Miles. That traces back to Miles, the pottery manufacturer in central South Carolina. And so I do think that my father would have had this in mind, though he didn't say it. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because it leads me to also share that as educators, as teachers, as parents, we can teach so many things without words. We can teach so many things by taking the children under our care out into the world and helping them to learn to love nature, to learn to be at home in nature, and to learn to see natural elements as their friends.
Hi. Where is Lemon Swamp?
I don't know. That's why I asked. See if you all know where Lemon Swamp is. I wonder. Do you know? She may know.
Near Bamberg, South Carolina.
She said near Bamberg.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you 2 times. Will you speak to the ancestors of those enslaved coming directly from Africa with nothing but their memories of the environment, their memories of foraging and healing, and how that practice might be going away, because it's primarily women handing down those traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So sometimes it's represented that enslaved people who were forcibly brought from Africa to here came with nothing. But that's not the case, as the question points to. They came with their experiences, they came with their memories, they came with their family lines. They were participants in religious traditions in which they had a very strong belief in ancestors being real and alive and reachable. They came from spiritual traditions in which they believed that there was kind of a high God, and there were also kind of intermediary gods, that there were gods represented through nature, and there were ancestors who had power. They came with all their knowledge, they came with their skills. There's a good deal of research about how when enslavers were looking to buy people, they were attending to where those individuals were from, looking to see if they might have skills in growing rice, for example. So they came with all kinds of things. They didn't come empty-minded, they didn't come empty-hearted, they didn't come empty-handed, and much of what they knew, they passed along through oral tradition. This would have been songs, this would have been stories, this would have been kind of information, knowledge, spiritual understandings. And they also shared what they knew and lived what they knew into the world through embodied practice. And this was primarily through making music, through drumming, through dance. Drumming was banned in South Carolina during the period of enslavement, in part because enslavers/lawmakers seemed to recognize that there was information in the sound of the drum, right? That skill would have been brought from various homelands in Africa and transformed so that those skills were fitted into this new environment. So while we can't be 100% precise about exactly what action or exactly what idea survived the Middle Passage, we do know that a West African and Central African cosmological sense, a spiritual understanding, philosophies, values were brought here. And some of those notions are still with the descendants of enslaved people. There are a lot of things that I feel to be true, maybe that I believe might be true, that are not based in my Christian upbringing. For example, there are many people who are not with us on this earth, who I love, and the person who I'm close with, who is not with us here now, is my grandmother. When I knock over something in the kitchen, like if I spill something in the kitchen, I don't know why I think this, I don't know where I learned this, but I think that my grandmother is saying, hey, I want some of that. And often I'm trying to, cook with her recipes. So when I have that experience, I will take a bowl or I will take a glass and I will put some of it out for my grandmother.
We are at the end of our question time. I'm sorry. In the interest of respecting Professor Miles's schedule and getting her out on time, it's just time to move to our next phase, which is our reception. So please join us in Keller Hall, which is the room right back here through the curtains. Maybe just give Dr. Miles a moment to get out.
Thank you. Thank you. That's how, yeah. Thank you. You all are so kind. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in a moment over there.